Prime Minister Boris Johnson cut his visit to the United States short, returning home to face Parliament and the never-ending Brexit story. Here's Joe Mays in London on what a hard Brexit might look like.
We tried to set out what that first 24 hours might look like if it is the case we end up in a no-deal Brexit. And remember, this is what Boris Johnson is promising to do if he can't get a deal with Brussels. He has said the UK will leave the EU on October 31st. So we've kind of taken him at his word here and said, okay, well, if that were to happen, what would happen next? And so we have followed various individuals who'd find themselves in fairly dramatic situations if it were to be the case that there was a no-deal Brexit. So, for example, we follow a lorry driver going through the port of Dover down to Calais and then to Paris to make a time-critical delivery. We follow a farmer on the Irish border who suddenly has to cope with that change in Ireland, and we follow a musician who's about to go on tour in Europe. So all these individuals who could face pretty meaningful and significant disruption if a no-deal Brexit were to occur.
Well, and let's talk about the ports in particular, because that's really questionable. I think everybody's wondering, if we do have a hard Brexit, how do they operate? The Port of Dover, we're talking about the Channel crossing. There was a stat in there that you said 10,000 trucks go through the ferries every day at these ports, carrying almost 1/6 of all trade and goods to the European Union. I mean, this is huge.
Exactly. It's probably the most important crunch point for Britain when it comes to trade, and it's the area where the government is really keen to make sure there isn't disruption. But as we talk about in our story, there is a certain limitation on what the British government can do to keep that traffic flowing, because the British can't control what the French will do. What will the French customs officials do when those trucks start coming over in a no-deal Brexit scenario? I think the fear the government has is that the French government will be quite strict in its application of the rules, and that will mean that trucks end up being pulled over if they don't have the right documentation. And remember, they will need new documentation in a no-deal Brexit scenario, because the UK will no longer be in the EU, we'll have no agreement, and we need all these extra customs forms. So that's the worry, and that's where the disruption could occur, as we talk about in the story.
Let's talk about that farmer at the Irish border, because I think it's fascinating that as he's dealing with his herd, he could be kind of, in violation, not in violation, in violation. Explain that.
So the thing to know about the Irish border is that it's not a straight line, and that the Irish border is a real kind of squiggle, and therefore you have individuals who have farmland on both sides, and just to cross their farm they might end up crossing the Irish border on several occasions. And that's the case for Jazz McDonald, the farmer we talk about in our story. And so the problem that he faces is that if he has sheep in Northern Ireland and he wants to move them, say, 100 yards down the road to another field, he would have to cross into the Republic of Ireland, and in a no-deal Brexit that would be illegal. That would be smuggling. He would have to go through a customs checkpoint to declare these animals, because the rules say if you're moving livestock into the EU from a non-EU country, you must have it checked. So that's the kind of issue that he would face on the first day of a no-deal Brexit. Obviously, it's an open question as to whether the Irish government would actually physically install those checkpoints on the Irish border. Clearly a very politically sensitive issue.
What's kind of our takeaway, our bigger, broader takeaway here? Because it sounds like initially it isn't a doomsday scenario.
Don't necessarily expect significant visible disruption on the first day of a no-deal Brexit. I think many of the impacts that have been talked about that could occur, if they do occur, they would happen in the days and weeks after. It will take some time for the disruption to flow through. And that's mainly because if there is to be disruption at the ports and trucks get held up and so on, it would at least be 2-3 days, a week after, before the rest of the supply chain feels that effects. But also, people have built stockpiles. So companies have stockpiled goods. They can run those stockpiles down, which will see them through the first few days and weeks. It's then, after that, they would start to feel some pain if that disruption has continued.
Staying with politics, President Trump using his speech at the United Nations this week to reiterate complaints about China's trade practices.
But as I have made very clear, I will not accept a bad deal for the American people.
Deal or no deal, the expanding global trade war is already hitting close to home. Let's bring in reporter Sean Donnan. He follows trade and globalization for us here at Bloomberg. He joins us from D.C. Sean, great to have you here. Your story this week in the magazine, I feel like we need to get ready for maybe, is it trade war number 3? It's expanding in terms of concerns about trade with Europe.
Absolutely. So we're getting ready for the next front, and that's going to really start to unfurl in the coming days as the Trump administration starts to roll out new tariffs on the EU. And those are the result in the first wave that we're going to see of a long-running battle between Airbus and Boeing that has been fought at the World Trade Organization. we're expecting the WTO to authorize the U.S. to levy something like $8 billion in tariffs on the EU, and that is going to hit the EU hard. But it's also going to blow back here in the U.S. There are some states like Alabama that have some pretty close ties with not only the EU and European businesses more broadly, but Airbus pretty directly.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and certainly you talk about the European direct foreign investment into the state of Alabama. The biggest one is from the EU, correct?
Absolutely. They are the biggest investors in a number of states, including Alabama. There's two big factories that we think about when we think about the European presence in Alabama. Down in Mobile, there is an Airbus plant where they now assemble A320 planes, and they're going to start assembling A220 planes. And then up near Tuscaloosa, there's a big Mercedes plant that's been there since the 1990s. There's something like 8,000 people that go through the gates there every day. They turn out 245,000 vehicles a year, including a lot of those new Mercedes SUVs you see on the street. And a lot of those SUVs actually get exported from from Alabama to places like China.
Well, global